The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Pathways to Exploration, a review of the future of human space exploration. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas. At a fundamental level, space exploration, the mission of NASA, is about inspiration. This inspiration fuels our desire to push the boundaries of the possible and reach beyond our own pale blue dot. When the President canceled the Constellation program in 2010, our chance to explore beyond low Earth orbit was significantly delayed. To the dismay of the American people, the administration made it clear that human space exploration was not a priority. The first human footsteps on the moon are a distant memory, and with the retirement of the space shuttle, NASA now pays Russia $70 million to transport an American astronaut to the International Space Station and back. There's a sense that America is falling behind with our best days behind us. Today, America's finest spaceships and largest rockets are found in museums rather than on launch pads. The President has proposed capturing an asteroid and tugging it into lunar orbit for human exploration. But NASA's own advisors said, quote, it was not considered to be a serious proposal, end quote. Space exploration experts have criticized this plan before our committee, and former NASA officials have called into question its merits. The administration's continued focus on costly distractions is harmful to our space program and does not inspire future generations to go into innovative fields such as science and math. However, a distinguished panel of experts has concluded that a return to, quote, extended surface operations on the moon, end quote, would make significant contributions to landing people on Mars. The same has not been said for the asteroid retrieval mission, which is a mission without a realistic budget, without a destination, and without a certain launch date. The witnesses before us today represent decades of public policy work and scientific investigation. They co-chaired the Committee on Human Spaceflight that recently released a report entitled Pathways to Exploration, Rationales and Approaches for a U.S. Program of Human Space Exploration. This report confirmed that NASA lacks a plan for human space exploration. The NASA Authorization Act, which recently passed the House, requires a detailed plan for how NASA will land humans on Mars. This report offers suggestions on the best way to reach that goal. Meanwhile, the Obama administration continues to advocate increasing climate change funding at NASA at the expense of other priorities such as space exploration. There are 18 federal agencies that fund climate change research, but only one does space exploration. The future of America's exploration efforts lead to Mars. Just as the first steps on the moon were by Americans, the first flag to fly on another planet in our solar system should be that of the United States. Great nations do great things. President Kennedy's call to America wasn't just about reaching the moon. It was a reminder that we are an exceptional nation. We must rekindle within NASA the fire that blazed the trail to the moon. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all. I'd like also to welcome our distinguished witnesses to today's hearing. I make no secret of the fact that I consider National Aeronautics and Space Administration to be a critical national asset. NASA is a source of technological and scientific innovation, an inspiration to generations of young people, a catalyst for economic growth, and a very positive symbol of American preeminence worldwide, as well as visible demonstration of our commitment to international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. Simply put, NASA is about the future. Now it is a fact that NASA's human spaceflight activities account for a significant share of the resources invested in NASA. We need to ensure that those resources are invested wisely. That is why this morning's hearing is so important. At Congress's direction, the National Academies undertook a comprehensive review of the future of human space exploration in the United States. That review has been completed, and it is now up to Congress and the administration to decide what we will do in response to the findings and recommendations contained in its final report. This is a report that does not mince words, and for that we should be very grateful. As I said when the report was first released, the National Academies has provided the nation with an important wake-up call. Their conclusions are clear. We are not going to have a human space exploration program worthy of this great nation if we continue down the current path of failing to provide the resources needed to make real progress and failing to embrace a clear goal and pathway to achieving that goal. As members of Congress, the ball is in our court, and we have choices to make. We can choose to continue to argue about which president or who in Congress is to blame for the current state of our human space exploration program, but I earnestly hope that we won't. We are where we are, and we can't change the past. Our focus needs to be on how we proceed from this point forward. And I hope that our witnesses can provide some useful counsel to us in that regard. In addition, we can choose to continue to pretend that a business-as-usual approach to our human space exploration program will suffice. But I hope we won't do that either, because the report we're reviewing today makes clear that business as usual is not a sustainable approach. Whatever resources we're able to invest need to be invested effectively and efficiently toward the attainment of a clearly articulated goal. We really can't afford to do otherwise. Finally, the National Academies panel makes clear that we don't have unlimited time to decide what kind of human space exploration program we want for the nation. It may be tempting for some to say that we shouldn't invest necessary resources in space exploration until we first fix Medicare or Medicaid, eliminate the deficit, or address a host of other major policy issues that have been identified by members at various times. It's tempting to use those issues as an excuse for inaction, but the National Academies makes a compelling case that we do not have that luxury if we want to maintain meaningful human space exploration capability in this nation, which I strongly believe we do. We should, of course, address those other issues, but that should not prevent us from investing in our future in the meantime. And make no mistake about it, our nation's human space exploration program, with an ultimate goal of landing humans on Mars, is about our future and that of our children and grandchildren. Mr. Chairman, the National Academies has done a great service by understanding the study that we will be undertaking, the study that we will be hearing about today. I hope that this morning's hearing will be the first step in achieving a revitalized and focused exploration program for America. I want to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do just that. In closing, I again want to welcome our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We will now proceed to introduce the witnesses. And to introduce our first witness, I'll recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our first witness is Governor Mitch Daniels, the president of Purdue University, which has graduated 23 astronauts, including Neil Armstrong. Prior to this appointment, he served 2 terms as the 49th governor of my home state of Indiana. He also served as Chief of Staff to Senator Richard Lugar, Senior Advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and Director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush. In addition to his strong record of public service, he has served as a Senior Executive at Eli Lilly, based in Indianapolis, among other positions he's held. President Daniels earned his bachelor's degree from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton and his J.D. from Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome, Governor Daniels.
Thank you, Dr. Buchan. I'll introduce our second witness, who is Dr. Jonathan Lunine, the Director of the Center for Radiophysics and Space Research and the David C. Duncan Professor in the Physical Sciences at Cornell University. He is co-investigator of the Juno mission to Jupiter and an interdisciplinary scientist for the James Webb Space Telescope. Dr. Lenine has chaired and served on committees for NASA and the National Science Foundation. He also is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Lenine received his bachelor's in physics and astronomy from the University of Rochester and his master's and PhD in planetary science from the California Institute of Technology. We welcome you both today. It's nice to have two experts on the subject present, and Governor Daniels will begin with you.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, we thank you for this opportunity to be here on behalf of our Committee on Human Spaceflight, established in response to the NASA Authorization Act of 2010. That act called on NASA to ask the national academies to review the goals, core capabilities, and direction of our nation's human spaceflight program. And we released our report on June 5th. Dr. Lenine and I are here to summarize it for you. As envisioned in that 2010 Act, the committee membership was very diverse, composed not solely or even mostly of experts from the human spaceflight community, but instead had members from fields as diverse as planetary science, astronomy, political science and history, sociology, public opinion and polling, economics, human spaceflight experience, international peace and security, and others. All of us came into this process with open minds and brought to the work our divergent points of view. In the end, we came to the strong consensus that there is a convincing case to be made for a continuation of our nation's human spaceflight program, provided that the pathways, approach, and decision rules recommended in our report are adopted. We did so because we became convinced only after lengthy discussion and analysis that a combination of what we labeled the pragmatic and the aspirational rationales, including the human impulse to explore and search for new knowledge in places we have never been, justifies the cost, the risk, and the opportunities associated with sending humans beyond low Earth orbit, and especially toward the horizon goal we identify as Mars. Getting humans to the surface of Mars will be a daunting challenge. It is immensely difficult, probably more so than most laymen and even many experts have recognized. Succeeding in this endeavor will require, we believe, a very different way of doing business than the nation has been practicing in recent decades, particularly as it's likely to take 30 years or more to reach the goal. As its highest priority recommendation, the committee recommends what we call a pathways approach, requiring the government to come to a consensus on achieving a highly disciplined set of objectives from which the nation would not deviate over time. A pathway in this scenario would involve a predefined set of chosen destinations and milestones, each of which would generate technical and engineering requirements which, as much as possible, would feed forward into the next goal and eventually the horizon goal. The committee does not recommend any specific pathway. That's for you and for future leadership. But we do note in our report that any pathway that could successfully land humans on the surface of Mars would require funding above constant dollars. Pursuing unwaveringly the consensus choice of a pathway over the term of multiple decades required by and the sustained support of the advances required by the resulting exploration architecture are the keys to a sustainable approach to human space flight. Mr. Chairman, I can't stress enough how critical it is the nation take a new approach, different from the recent way of doing business in space. Work needs to begin soon on the most difficult and mission-critical technical challenges of any pathway to Mars. And out of many such challenges, our committee singles out Mars entry, descent and landing, in-space propulsion and power, and radiation safety for very special emphasis. In addition, we're in total agreement that achieving the goal of a human presence on Mars will require the U.S. to expand its partnerships with other spacefaring nations, including an openness to working with China with whatever safeguards might have to be put in place. Such international partnerships should include much greater cost sharing than our partners have provided up to now. And that can only happen if those partners are given the responsibility to provide substantial elements to the overall architecture, which they will help design and build. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we ask that readers of our report recognize that the risks of human spaceflight, including the risks to human life, are high, and setbacks are inevitable. Lives are likely to be lost in pursuit of such a tremendous endeavor, and governing statutes will need to recognize that grim fact. And while we recognize that many of our recommendations will be seen by many as unrealistic or perhaps even naive, we would observe that absent changes along the lines we are recommending, the goal of reaching Mars in any meaningful time frame is itself unrealistic. Our committee hopes that our report will carry the national conversation forward in the direction of realism. Realism about public opinion, about risk, about cost, and about the incredibly daunting technical challenges of the horizon goal we hope the world embraces. And most of all, we hope to foster greater realism about the fact that if we really do want to go to Mars, then many actors, public and private, need to change long-standing behaviors and expectations. We're optimistic the public will support a consensus national goal, and we believe the rationales justify its pursuit. We believe the achievement would be monumental if it occurred, but we think there's really one and possibly only one approach to get there, and we've offered up our best ideas in support of that approach.
Thank you, Governor Daniels and Dr. Lunine.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Johnson, members, let me add my thanks to you all for giving us the opportunity to talk about this report this morning. We recognize it's a very long report with a lot of detail, and so if you cannot or have not read the entire document, certainly Chapter 1 is the important chapter to read. And there you will find our major findings and recommendations on issues such as public and stakeholder opinions about space exploration and human spaceflight in general. In particular, an honest and detailed independent analysis of the technical and affordability realities associated with the 3 example exploration pathways that we've put together that lead to Mars. An examination of the rationales for human spaceflight, and most importantly, our recommendation on adopting what we call the pathways approach that we believe will help our nation achieve that next giant leap for humankind. Anybody who reads about the history of space will come to realize very quickly that there are many myths that surround both public opinion and proven benefits from human spaceflight. If the decision to pursue human spaceflight were based simply on the available data on proven benefits that uniquely accrue from this endeavor, or were based on public opinion being in the majority supporting a particular program in advance, then we would likely not go. We also recognize that by these kinds of criteria, Americans would never have set foot on the moon, and yet that achievement is now viewed as a source of inspiration and great pride by many, if not most, Americans. In fact, Mr. Chairman, it's been political leadership that determines whether our nation will pursue major new ventures. Our elected leaders have shown courage and vision in the pursuit of human endeavors in space, and when those visions are implemented, such as with Apollo or the shuttle, the public is retrospectively supportive of the expenditures of our tax dollars on what are viewed as endeavors of national importance. In the end, it was the judgment of this diverse committee that the aggregate of the aspirational and pragmatic rationales does argue for a continuation of the nation's human spaceflight program. In effect, the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. Whether to pursue human exploration beyond low Earth orbit in a truly sustainable way is a decision that deserves careful consideration by our nation's leaders, stakeholders, and the public at large. And in making that decision, it will be paramount to ask the question, what would a future be like where there were no expectation that Americans would once again venture into space? But as such decisions are contemplated, we cannot ignore the significant leaps in technical capability that will be required to land and sustain humans on Mars. Governor Daniels has talked about some of those key technologies, and these will be extremely difficult to develop in terms of cost, schedule, technical challenges, and gaps between current and needed capabilities. Achieving these leaps was the motivation behind our recommendation of adopting a pathways approach, since only a sustained program that builds upon a sequence of technical and exploration successes can buy down the risk involved in getting to Mars in a reasonable time frame. In one of the possible pathways analyzed in detail in the report, and these are example pathways, we included as a stepping stone extended human operations on the lunar surface. Our technical panel concluded, and the committee concurred, that extended surface operations on the moon, not Apollo-style sorties, but extended surface operations, would make significant contributions to reaching the Horizon goal through development and testing of key operational technologies. Mr. Chairman, Mars really is incredibly hard, and to reach that Horizon goal will cost decades, hundreds of billions of dollars, and human lives. To be a sustainable program, it will require a steadfast national commitment to a consensus goal, international collaboration, and a budget that increases by more than the rate of inflation. If the nation does decide to undertake one of the greatest of human technical endeavors it has ever attempted, and we assert that there is not much time in which to make this decision, we have provided in our report what we call the Pathways Principles that will help in the choice of a consensus pathway to that goal, and decision rules that will serve as guidelines on how to manage the pursuit of the chosen pathway when stressors such as diminished budgets might arise. Our committee is convinced that these principles and decision rules provide a way for our national leadership to decide on a given pathway, measure progress in its pursuit, navigate off one pathway to another, or cease the endeavor altogether. But in the end, it's our elected leaders who will be the critical enablers of our nation's investment in human spaceflight that ultimately, one day, may put American astronauts on the red soil of Mars. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today on this critical national question.
Thank you, Dr. Lunine, and I'll recognize myself for questions. One of the conclusions of your report is as follows. To continue on the present course is to invite failure, disillusionment, and the loss of the long-standing international perception that human spaceflight is something the United States does best. That's an incredible summary of where we stand today, and I don't know that too many people would disagree with it. My first question, Governor Daniels, may I direct to you, and that is, does the Obama administration have a plan to get to Mars, as difficult and as costly as it might be? And Dr. Lunine, I hope it doesn't cost lives, but inevitably exploring new frontiers does. But Governor Daniels, does the administration have a path, have a plan to get to Mars as we sit here today?
Mr. Chairman, I believe our committee's statement, the one that you read and others that we made, were meant to refer not to any one administration, but really to a persistent pattern now, and I think we speak in terms of decades. And so to say that, as we do, that at the present time, business as currently conducted won't get us to Mars is a statement we could equally have made about the posture of NASA and our program as it stood at other points in the past. And we do believe that it will be necessary, and sooner rather than later, for the nation, all of it, whatever administration's in authority at the time, the Congress as it's constituted at the time, NASA, and the private space community for that matter, to agree on an approach that, while it may not be everyone's favorite, everyone will agree to sustain and support over the lengthy time that will be necessary. And that we do not have today.
Okay. Thank you, Governor. And Dr. Lunine, this next question is actually addressed to both you and Governor Daniels. And that is, were we to say that landing astronauts on the Mars was a goal that we wanted to achieve, what are the comparative disadvantages of the asteroid retrieval mission, or the advantages of going back to the moon as a stepping stone to the landing of astronauts on the moon?
Mr. Chairman, we looked at what we called 3 example exploration pathways for getting from today to the surface of Mars.
Yep. I think I said surface of the moon. I meant Mars.
You actually said Mars in the end, yes.
Okay.
So these are, again, they're examples only, and in the end, should the nation decide to do this, of course, there may be a different set of stepping stones, a different exploration pathway. But we did look at one pathway that involved the ARM, Asteroid Redirect Mission, another that involved initially lunar sorties and then a lunar outpost before moving on to the surface of Mars, and then another pathway that we called enhanced exploration that involved visiting asteroids in native orbits, the lunar surface, the Martian moons, and ultimately the Martian surface. The differences among these three pathways have to do principally with the number of steps that are available in which to develop the key technologies that will be needed to get to the surface of Mars. A whole list of technologies that I won't articulate in my answer to this question, but we can if you wish. The ARM to Mars exploration pathway, in which one goes from the asteroid redirect mission to the Martian moons and then to the Martian surface, has effectively the smallest number of stepping stones, but the greatest technological leaps are required in going beyond ARM to get to Mars. And in particular, a number of technologies that are key to landing on Mars and getting astronauts back are not developed in the context of the ARM mission. They have to be developed after that, but there are no stepping stones on which to actually test them. And some of the technologies developed for ARM are what we call dead-end technologies that are not useful, as far as the committee can see, in the succeeding steps to going toward Mars. So that's the essential issue with respect to that particular pathway.
And going back to the moon would be an advantage for the opposite reasons. Is that correct?
So in the pathway in which there were essentially lunar sorties and a lunar outpost, there would be an opportunity to test technologies that would be required in partial G environments for extended stays on the Martian surface, to which astronauts would be committed.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired, but I want to make one more point, and that is to focus on the most recent proposed budget by this administration for NASA, and to point out that the administration's proposed budget for NASA is $1.8 billion than the last budget under the Bush administration, which seems to me that the administration is not making space exploration a priority. That concludes my time, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's almost comical to hear your last statement. It's the kind of struggle we had for reauthorization of NASA in this committee. It had nothing to do with the administration. But I want to say to the witnesses, first of all, do both of you stand by the report and the contents of the report? So you feel that it really is important for the nation to find a way to be involved in this kind of research? Now, Governor, I'm a product of a school of Indiana, St. Mary's at the University of Notre Dame, and I know you're not a spendthrift, and nor is Indiana as a state. And I'm from Texas, so you can take that for what it's worth. But if you really do think from this research that this is a goal that this nation should achieve, do you think it's important enough to convince the people on the other side of the aisle to help us to get going? Because it seems to me that if every day that we wait, we're wasting time. We have had people in the past who had that foresight that allowed this to happen. And we are realistically in a financial bind, but we cannot shut the door to our future. Tell me how you really feel about this.
Well, I agree with, first of all, thanks for mentioning your St. Mary's credential. Now I've got another reason to admire you, Congresswoman,
Okay.
and now I know why you turned out so well.
Thank you.
Yes, emphatically, I do agree. I want to stress, I made mention in the short opening that I do believe all of us brought to the committee an open mind. We spent a lot of time asking the fundamental question that we were assigned: should the nation do this at all? And if so, on what basis? And that was not a reflex judgment, I don't think, by anybody, let alone the whole group. And I do share it, having listened to those discussions, all the witnesses, all the literature that we surveyed. And I also would observe, I think it's accurate to say that this is one issue, mercifully, that I don't think divides us particularly on partisan lines. I think there are people who are very enthusiastic that we heard from, who may disagree strongly about other things, and people who question the value, likewise, can be found in both camps. But we hope that our report makes a strong case for proceeding and lays out, however, in the most candid way we could, the preconditions for succeeding, which will be much harder, I think, for folks to come to terms with than the abstract idea of whether we should go and whether we're enthusiastic about somehow finding resources.
Doctor.
Well, I agree with Governor Daniels. I want to emphasize how broad the background of the committee members, in fact, is or was. This was not a committee of astronauts or aerospace engineers. We had historians, we had sociologists, we had business people. It was and very skeptical people, I have to say, right at the beginning. And I was somewhat myself skeptical that we could come to consensus. And in the end, this very diverse committee of experts came to a strong consensus on the conclusions of the report. And that, to me, I found quite remarkable.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you very much, and I want to welcome our witnesses, especially Governor Daniels, who we've worked together in the past on many various projects that were successful. And now we want to make sure that we look at America's space program and see if we can give it some direction with what we've learned. Let me ask right off the bat, the study that we're talking about, did it come to a conclusion as to how much money it would cost for a Mars mission?
Congressman Rohrabacher, we did not actually try to total up and provide a final number to 3 digits on what a Mars mission would cost, but the technical panel in their analysis did look at the cost of various elements, developing various elements. Mm-hmm. And essentially then what you would see in Chapter 4 are these sand charts that show what is required in terms of budgets relative to today in order to accomplish these goals.
And could you give us a little hint about what they are?
So I'll give you 2 numbers. One is that in order to accomplish this goal, the human space exploration program would have to rise by something on the order of 2 or 3% higher than inflation rate in order to meet the rising cost in the sand chart. And the total cost, as we say in our report, of a of a program that ends at Mars is on a scale of hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hundreds of billions of dollars, and I would just like to say that I think that eventually humankind will get to Mars, and what we really are talking about now is making sure we get to Mars earlier than what might happen 100 years from now, correct? Okay, hundreds of billions of dollars to get to Mars a little earlier, not maybe maybe a lot earlier than what we would otherwise get there. So what areas do you think, as far as I can see, that means that we would have to have major international cooperation, which you mentioned with China, as well as other nations. And we'd also perhaps have to make sure that the private sector got involved in space and took up some of the slack of what NASA might now be doing as part of a governmental program. Maybe SpaceX and some of these others could come in and start doing some of the more commercial type of activities. In terms of China and space cooperation with countries like China, doesn't that sort of sit with you in a, what if somebody said in 1937, we really want to develop this rockets to go to the moon, and you know, this guy over there in Germany has really got a good rocket program, maybe we should cooperate with him. Doesn't that, the fact that China now is the world's worst human rights abuser, isn't the fact that China now is committing acts of aggression all along the Pacific Rim with the Philippines, with Japan and others, doesn't that sort of affect our decision as to whether we're going to cooperate with that country?
Well, I'm going to punt part of your question over to Governor Daniels, if that's okay, but I want to make one point, which is that in Chapter 4 of the report, it's important to recognize that there's a very strong inflection point in terms of the budget profiles. A budget profile that only rises with inflation or, well, only with inflation, essentially will not get us to Mars in any foreseeable time. The program just does not close. With respect to collaboration, international collaboration, one of our pathways principles is to seek continuously to engage new partners, and that can be international partners, other federal agencies, and commercial entities as well. So that's a key part of our report. Do you want to answer that?
Well, the committee recognized how difficult this and complex this subject is. I mean, for openers, and it's important, I think, in every answer we give or every dimension in which we think about this subject, to remember the incredible time frames over which we're talking. Countries that are friends today might not be friends in 2040 or 2050.
That's a good point.
Which might be as soon as we can get there under the best of circumstances, and vice versa. Space has always been to some extent a place where nations that competed vigorously have found it useful or at least possible to collaborate, and Russia, not exactly the best actor on the planet right now either, but they are our intimate partner with regard to the space station, as the chairman
Of course, we'll end up borrowing money from China if we don't make them our partners. We're going to borrow it from them anyway.
Yes, well, this is relevant in many respects to the discussion we had. Let me just make I think a related point. It certainly links back to the previous question too. When we talk about the amount of money involved here, it's a lot of money, but we are talking about over decades. This committee knows, but not every citizen knows, that the NASA human spaceflight budget's a couple tenths of % of the federal budget. And increases in it will be rounding errors in the larger sense. We all know that the real issues with regard to making sure we can meet all our national priorities on Earth or beyond have to do with the way in which autopilot safety net programs are devouring the discretionary funds for NASA, the FBI, the Park Service, and so many other things that we value. So those two pieces, I think, of perspective are important when we talk about the money. And finally, a learning point, I think, for me and maybe other committee members, there's just as a pathways approach, the committee believes, is a prerequisite to success. I'll just say that there's not a lot of point in spending more money above inflation if we just spend it the way we do today. So the sine qua non, I think our report is pretty clear on, is a new disciplined, sustained approach, the kind we try to elaborate. Given that approach, then yes, the data do say that something above flatline spending would be required. Similarly, with regard to partnerships in the first instance, we look at history, turn out to be more expensive. They're not cost-saving. They're the complexity, the time that is added sometimes in getting agreement can add costs. So you really will need, whether it's China or anybody else, you really will need very substantial, more than the historical levels of cost sharing, first just to break even, let alone to bring down the overall burden.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Governor and Doctor, for being here today, and thank you so much for leading the National Research Council report. We, on the committee, I know, really appreciate it. You're right, Governor, that we've had a lot of discussions about space flight that have united this committee, and they also have the potential to unite the country. And we let our imaginations really be ignited by the incredible work done by NASA. We've had a lot of discussions in this committee and in the Space Subcommittee about the leadership and the long-term thinking that's involved in looking at space flight. We've had some interesting discussions here about the strategic direction, and that's why we especially appreciate your report. You know, what are the benefits of going back to the moon, or do we focus on Mars? Do we have the asteroid retrieval mission? So we're really glad that we have your background and your expertise. And I want to follow up on the previous conversation about international collaboration. We've talked about that a lot in this committee, and I noticed that one of the things in the report that you mentioned is that it's evident that U.S. near-term goals for human exploration are not aligned with those of our traditional international partners. While most spacefaring nations and agencies are looking toward the moon, specifically the lunar surface, U.S. plans are focused on redirection of an asteroid into retrograde lunar orbit, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about whether we should stop discussing going back to the moon and really focus on Mars, or do we need to continue to have those conversations about returning to the moon as part of international collaboration if, in fact, those goals are different?
Well, thank you. It's an excellent question. Of course, it was an observation, and we had personal testimony and chance to question leaders of every international space program. And I think it's an accurate reflection of what we heard from them to say that they lack enthusiasm, at least at this point, for the ARM idea. They have been more interested, and told us so, in the lunar surface. And my friend Jonathan talked in answer to a previous question about the reasons our committee saw some advantages to that. There were, going to the Martian surface, it might be extraordinarily helpful to have been on some surface first, as opposed to leaping there without benefit of that direct experience. I think that's part of the thinking of our international partners or potential partners as we heard it. But again, it wasn't in our charge, and it's not part of our report to make any specific recommendation. Only to say that at some stage, and we hope it's before long, the nation needs to pick such a route and stick to it.
Thank you, and I want to try to get another question in. You, Dr. Lunine, you talked about the myths, and it was interesting to hear you say that if we relied on public opinion polling, things might be very, very different. I've talked a lot in this committee, and we've had a lot of discussions about part of the role of NASA is to inspire students to go into science fields. I also serve on the Education Committee. We have a lot of discussions about that. Can you talk about whether NASA is doing enough to really share its successes, its potential with the public? Because I tell you, when we're talking with our constituents, they don't understand all the benefits of space exploration, both in the short term and the long term, and historically. So are they doing enough? Is there more that can be done either through NASA or in other ways so that we can help to shift the public opinion and see the benefits?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. The myth I was referring to in particular with respect to public opinion is that during the development of Apollo there was large-scale public support for that program. And in fact, what our public and stakeholders outreach panel found is that that really was not the case. But in retrospect, the public supported that program, looking back on it, and the same seems to be true now for the shuttle. With respect to your second question, we did not look in detail at NASA's Education and Public Outreach program as a committee, so I can't speak to that in the context of the report. My personal experience with NASA is that it does an excellent job of providing materials through the web and other means for the public to be engaged in space exploration of all types. And I've been a part of that to some extent, and I think that certainly a large part of what we do in space now is immediately accessible to the public through the web.
That's great.
May I add just a quick word? I think
If the chair will allow.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
I do think it's an important, really important question, and I would only add that I believe if there were a secret sauce that NASA could have applied that would ignite a different level of public excitement, it would have happened a long time ago. When we talk about realism about public opinion, we're just trying to look in a clear-eyed fashion at the data Jonathan just talked about, and really what it says is that this will require national leadership. Many things do. Many things are not many of the great achievements of this nation and this government have not been directly responsive to a previous public outcry. And so what we do find in the data is that where leadership occurs and then progress occurs, the public is proud and the public then responds very strongly.
Thank you very much, and my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The NASA Authorization Act of 2014, which just passed the House of Representatives by a near unanimous vote, includes a requirement that NASA develop a roadmap for the future of human exploration, which defines key milestones and decision points for an expanded human presence in the solar system. Would a formal roadmap for future missions be helpful for NASA? What types of information would you expect should be included in such a roadmap? And how can NASA practically incorporate your recommendations for a sustainable program into this roadmap? That question's for both of you.
Congressman, the central core recommendation of our report, which is the Pathways approach, essentially consists of a very specific set of steps to a horizon goal. Now, in the sense that a roadmap would embrace those specific steps, yes, that would be useful. But I think that the Pathways approach goes beyond roadmaps, which often are things that have quite a bit of flexibility or some indefinite end to them, to a process where instead there is a definite horizon goal, and this committee recommends Mars. There are intermediate stepping stones, and those stepping stones have specific technological developments that are tied to them that are then needed ultimately for a landing on Mars, and also the stepping stones ahead of that, prior to that. And then the ability, if conditions do change, to make reasoned and rational changes in the pathway through a set of decision rules. So I see that as something more than a roadmap. I see that as, first of all, if the nation decides to commit to this, it is a very, how shall I say it, a very well-defined framework with pathways, with stepping stones, and with decision rules that have to be adhered to over years and decades in order to reach the final goal. It's a substantial undertaking, and it's more than a roadmap.
Thank you. Governor Daniels, you want
I think that's pretty well said. I would just, I suppose, emphasize that it will take a level of discipline that we have not, as a nation, shown. So, not picking on any one entity, person, branch, administration here. The discipline to adhere to the chosen pathway, whichever it is, over multiple administrations and a lot of turnover in Congress. It's not the natural state of affairs. We all know. We understand why, and that's why it'll be difficult to do. The discipline to abandon dead-end technologies that will not contribute meaningfully to the technical requirements of the next step or the step beyond. The discipline to rotate resources out of infrastructure that doesn't fit the pathway as soon as it's obvious that it doesn't. So these are, as I said earlier, a lot here that people, I think, can agree to in the abstract. Would be very, very call on us all to approach this in in a brand new way. But it's essential because the qualitative difference about this goal versus almost anything else we can think of is it takes 30 years or more to bring it off.
Well said. The administration has consistently requested less funding for the Space Launch System and the Orion Crew Capsule than is needed to keep the programs on schedule and reduce programmatic risk. The funding for Earth science at NASA has increased by 63% since 2007, while the overall budget has been reduced. How does your report address large priority shifts of this kind at the agency, and how can Congress ensure that there is not an artificial need for an off-ramp simply because the administration starves exploration for other priorities?
Well, I think the first step is that there has to be a national commitment to the ultimate Horizon goal. And if there is not that strong national commitment, then it's going to be difficult to pull off human exploration missions into deep space at all. We talk about Mars as the Horizon goal, but all of these require very strong commitment. These off-ramps are essentially termination points for such a program. And so, again, it's, I think, a matter not so much of technical issues, but political will to undertake a program like this that will cover decades.
Governor Daniels?
I think I'd just say that I don't think there's a lot of utility, right, in talking about this administration or any one administration. If we're going to make the national decision or set of decisions that we think's necessary for success here, it'll be something we will all have to confront in the years just ahead of us. And so it was said earlier, we are where we are, and that's my view too. It won't be just the next administration, the next Congress, whoever makes it up, but multiple ones. We hope there'll be a culture built in which there'll be a presumption of discipline, a presumption of sustaining the course that's chosen over all the difficulties and all the inevitable setbacks.
Thank you. And lastly, I'd just like to take a moment to follow up on the questions the chairman asked about the ARM. Dr. Lenine, you stated that in the report the committee agreed that ARM would lead to dead ends on the pathway approach. I want to emphasize that statement and reiterate my thoughts that the ARM is a costly distraction, and I'm hopeful that NASA will take the recommendations of this report to heart. And that's just not my personal opinion. That seems to be the majority opinion of the scientific community. At this time, I'd like to recognize Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Palazzo and Ranking Member Edwards. And I want to thank our Governor Daniels and Dr. Lunine for being here today and for your work as co-chairs of the Committee on Human Spaceflight. I agree with Governor Daniels' statement that human spaceflight should remain a major national priority, and I was glad to see your committee recognize the importance of NASA and human spaceflight. In Florida, my home state, the famous Kennedy Space Center has a special connection with NASA. Many of my constituents have visited the Space Center and were fortunate enough to visit at least one of our space shuttle launches. One of the hallmarks of this nation is our ability to dream big and to achieve the impossible. And NASA has exemplified this spirit for more than 5 decades. As members of Congress, we have the responsibility to keep this spirit alive. This means ensuring NASA has both the resources and guidance to continue reaching for new heights. To achieve NASA's far-reaching goals, long-term planning and sustained support are required. So I say let's keep working together in a bipartisan fashion to ensure NASA can continue its mission of discovery, technological innovation, and inspiration. I have a couple of questions. The United States currently works with Russia, Canada, and Japan. And these are the countries that participate in the European Space Agency on an international space station. In your report, you discussed the possibility of expanding international collaboration in spaceflight, including the potential of working with China. I recently visited China, and I was concerned. What lessons are there in our current collaboration that we can apply to future collaboration to ensure intellectual property and that classified information is adequately protected?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We recognize that as a committee as well, and we're also concerned. We also recognize that some of our traditional international partners are interested in collaborating with China as well, and whether the United States does or doesn't, we're likely to see collaboration between China and some of our traditional international partners. Governor Daniels was prompting me to tell a story that I think is correct. I've checked it with other committee members, and of course I was in high school at the time, but during the Apollo-Soyuz test project, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union worked together to achieve the first international docking in space of 2 human spacecraft, the docking module, which was the connector between the Apollo and the Soyuz, had a Russian end and an American end, and it was primarily a piece of U.S. hardware that was transported to Russia for testing, and in the context of one of those transports, apparently it was found that it had been disassembled and reassembled again, probably in Russian customs. So, this is the sort of thing that one has to watch for. Ultimately, if the nation decides that China is a partner of value in this major human endeavor, the program would have to be designed to safeguard our technologies. There's no question about that.
Okay. Thank you. We are currently forced to rely on Russia to transport our astronauts to the International Space Station. Is there any, when there is conflict between governments, how can we guarantee the concerns, the safety concerns for our astronauts? Has that been discussed or any plan in place as to what happens when there's conflict, which is something that we're fast approaching now with Russia?
Well, these are excellent questions and very legitimate concerns. I guess we talked about them in the committee. I guess one can only say that we did live through periods of intense disagreement, conflict with the Soviet Union while we collaborated. We are collaborating with Russia now at a time of when we have immense disagreements. These are very hard questions, and the intellectual property question, of course, may be even tougher. All that can be said is, as hard as those are to contemplate, and as big as those risks are, the idea of somehow going to Mars alone, probably even less promising, and it raises even bigger questions. And so that's why our committee thinks at least we have to be open to trying to solve these problems or properly safeguard against either property theft or maybe safety challenges. With regard to what is emerging as the other very vigorous, disciplined, purposeful space program on the planet.
I now recognize Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Challenger catastrophe, as we all well know, you had one engine failure that had a catastrophic effect on all the other engines and resulted in the destruction of the Challenger space shuttle, including a significant loss of life. Now, your report on page 4-38 claims, quote, Falcon Heavy is designed to tolerate the loss of thrust from several engines and still complete its mission, thus enhancing mission reliability, end quote. Given that the Falcon Heavy requires 27 Merlin 1D rocket engines to operate and given the Russian N-1 moon rocket, a system which failed 100% of the time, used almost the same number of engines, 30, please provide the analysis to back up the claim that the number of engines improves reliability. Isn't it likely that the SLS approach of using 2 proven booster engines and 4 proven core stage engines with over 40 years of space shuttle flight heritage will be significantly lower risk than a mission perspective, given that the risk of a catastrophic failure with 6 engines is less than a catastrophic failure with 27? Please comment.
Congressman, thank you for that question. Our technical panel evaluated a number of different technologies that would be needed for the early and late stages of a program that leads us ultimately to Mars. And as you know, the analysis was actually based on the Space Launch System, SLS, as the baseline. And in fact, all of the so-called design reference missions of record that were used by our technical panel to put together these exploration pathways, these example pathways, they all involve the SLS as the launch vehicle. The technical panel itself did look at other alternatives. It did include the Falcon Heavy in a brief discussion of the potential benefits and risks. But in fact, none of the scenarios that are actually in the document at present utilize the Falcon Heavy as the launch vehicle. If at some point this were to become an issue in terms of which launch vehicle to use, all of the scenarios that we have in Chapter 4 would have to be redone with Falcon Heavy in there. But beyond that, if you want more detail on how the technical panel arrived at that particular conclusion for the Falcon Heavy, we can certainly ask our technical panel chair to provide you some written answers to how they reached that conclusion.
Thank you. Next question. NASA's Small Bodies Assessment Group has commented on NASA's current plan to redirect an asteroid and send astronauts to visit it. In one report, the advisory group stated, quote, "While the participants found it to be very interesting and entertaining, it was not considered to be a serious proposal because of obvious challenges, including the practical difficulty of identifying a target in an appropriate orbit with the necessary physical characteristics within the required lead time using existing or near to long-term ground-based or space-based survey assets," end quote. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment, and why? And if you feel that expounding is beneficial, please do so.
So I have actually not read that report in detail, so I don't want to comment on it. And again, the task statement that we responded to in our report did not include a detailed assessment of the ARM. All I can say again is that in the context of the example exploration pathway where we included ARM, that particular mission developed several technologies that were then not useful for subsequent stepping stones on the way to Mars. In particular, the use of the solar electric propulsion, which is not sufficient to get humans to Mars, and the actual asteroid retrieval robotic vehicle. But again, this was all done in the context of that particular exploration pathway, and we did not conduct a scientific or technical assessment of the ARM specifically.
Yes, just to emphasize that it was not in our statement of task. In fact, I think it would have been a violation of the scope of our assignment if we had opined on the specific merits of any specific system or proposal. The ARM we did feature in one of the 3 sample pathways, and I think the right way to think about those is that they are meant to illuminate trade-offs. There are potential pluses and potential minuses to each pathway we looked at, and probably anyone that might be suggested in the future. And Jonathan just specified some of the downside risks of a pathway, including the ARM.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists today. You know, as I've been listening to the discussion, one of the things that occurs to me first is that I think that there is significant alignment between the House-passed authorization and the NRC's recommendations. I'm a little troubled by the description of the pathway as so distinct from the roadmap, because I think in this committee, as the chairman and I have envisioned what NASA would provide back to us, I don't see a lot of differences, frankly, in what you've outlined in your principles. But I view that as more semantics than anything, and we could certainly be more directive to NASA in that respect in terms of what it's going to provide back to this committee. I am curious as to whether you think it is appropriate for the committee to be prescriptive to NASA in terms of defining launch vehicles and specifications, interim destinations, and the like. I mean, you didn't do that in your panel report of experts, and so I'm curious as to whether you think that's an appropriate role for the Congress.
Well, it can't happen without the Congress ultimately, and but I think you make a very good point. This is probably not the optimal place for it to originate. What I think our committee would hope is that the Congress would unite around the idea that I just start with a very simple question. Do you want to go to Mars or don't you? If you want to go to Mars, whether we like it or not, certain things would have to be done very, very differently, and in a very unnatural act for any democratically elected government where people come and go and change, would have to be sustained over this extraordinary, probably uniquely long time frame that this achievement would take. And we know what we're biting off, what would be biting off to do that. But I think that it would have to start with a Congress that perhaps requested, demanded a set of choices from NASA, pathway choices, embraced one, hopefully on the broadest possible basis, so that it might have a chance of staying power over the years, something that people could look back on and say we'd be violating faith with this great adventure if we took a sudden detour the way and sent us off on some other direction the way they've been sent in the past. So I see that the central role, I think, would be Congress's, but probably not the place that it originates, or maybe not ideal.
So we shouldn't get into the nitty-gritty details of the technology and the science, but we could leave that to the experts, because I think that there has been a fair amount of unanimity on this committee, and you can see that in the authorization that passed, where I think we had only 2 dissenting votes in the Congress that said we have a big vision, we share that horizon goal of Mars, and we're going to enable NASA to have the opportunity to put some teeth to those proposals. I want to ask you about budget, because if we all share that horizon goal, can you tell me, just sort of ballpark, if you will, a budget that you think would be reflective of that goal, so that we're, in the 20 to 30 year range instead of the 30 to 50 year range? Because we're at roughly 4.1, $4.3 billion now for exploration, and that doesn't include the ISS, et cetera.
Well, Jonathan had the first go at this, so let me give it a try also. I think that quite properly the committee didn't go beyond expressing bands and ranges. The starting point is the ultimate budget would be driven very much by the pathway chosen. There are pathways which would be substantially more expensive, more extensive, and therefore more destinations and so forth, more expensive than others. So that's the first uncertainty. And then we just didn't want to commit the sin of false precision and start producing numbers over these long time horizons that nobody could be very confident.
So I don't think we want NASA committing to those sins either. But we do have to have a budget from the Congress and an appropriation from the Congress that reflects the kind of, big horizon goal that you've identified. Isn't that right?
Sure. And so just to recap, the committee believes that this is a worthy endeavor, belongs on the list of national priorities, believes that Mars is the appropriate horizon goal. But just to reiterate something said earlier, the first and prerequisite step is the commitment to a pathway. Maybe if roadmap means pathway, that'd be great to know, because that would indicate this committee was maybe prepared to take this vital first step. With that in place, then the best we were able to say was that something beyond a flatline budget, not by a huge amount probably, but something beyond. We couldn't make the numbers work even for the least expensive pathways with constant dollars.
Great. Well, thank you. I've greatly gone over my time. I will just conclude just by saying to the chairman, and I hope that he understands this, that if we're really to commit to this goal, if the Congress is, this is not about nickeling and diming other programmatic missions within NASA. It's really committing to it as a nation and then putting the dollars that match the goal and the opportunity. And with that, I conclude. Thanks.
Now recognize Mr. Bouchon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to say that, this is one of many hearings that we have that I attend talking about discretionary spending programs, of which NASA is one of those. And I think Governor Daniels somewhat alluded to it, but I usually say this at the opening, is that the federal government needs to address the entire pie of federal spending, and as we know right now, 40% of the budget is discretionary approximately, and 60% is mandatory. Unless we begin to address the known drivers of our national debt, all of us are going to be continually talking about how we're going to find money to do anything, including how we're going to go to Mars. That said, in the context of how the federal government, how NASA currently spends its dollars, when we talk about future budgets, I do think it's important to talk about efficiencies and effective ways to spend that money. And it can be done at the state level. Governor Daniels has made Indiana more effective and efficient in the way we use our dollars. When we know we have a fixed amount of money to spend, did the committee begin to address anything as it relates to how our current structure of the way we spend our money can be addressed in any substantial way that might not only allow us to have more money to spend that we already have, but in tight budgetary times maybe use that money more effectively and efficiently?
Congressman Bouchon, we did talk about this, of course, in a general sense. We didn't talk about specific NASA facilities and so on because, again, we're looking at methodology rather than a specific pathway. But one of our conclusions is that if we are going to embark on a pathway that leads to Mars and do it successfully in a finite amount of time, that in addition to developing things, other things have to be ended in some way, divested in the human spaceflight program. And so one of our pathways principles essentially says that, and I'll just read it straight out, it's a decision rule, that if there are human spaceflight program elements, infrastructure, and organizations that no longer contribute to progress along the pathway, the human spaceflight program should divest itself of them as soon as possible. And I think this speaks to the need for the kind of discipline and focus that would be required to achieve a goal as extraordinarily difficult and expensive as ultimately a human landing on Mars.
So at the end of the day, I mean, obviously Congress sometimes makes those decisions. You know, I mean, The A-10, for example, is a recent example, on the DoD side, where the Congress and the federal agency may disagree on the future of certain programs. It's a very difficult process, as all of us know. When it comes to the private sector, I'm really intrigued by how we can leverage, government dollars. The private sector can leverage government dollars to maybe do some things that maybe the government doesn't always do that effectively. I mean, Governor Daniels, do you have any comments about how we might, how do we leverage the private industry, and what do you see as maybe their role in the future of manned space flight?
I appreciate the question, because I think at least in some quarters our report has been read or misread to not emphasize sufficiently the role the private sector might play. We didn't mean for it to be read that way, but perhaps we just didn't say it loudly or plainly enough. No, I think we heard a lot of testimony, and we met with leaders of that community. There's a lot of possibilities there. And typically in this world, the greatest and most sudden unexpected breakthroughs come from private enterprise, and very, very likely will again and again over all the decades that we have between here and the lunar and the Martian surface. I can just testify as a fortunate person who gets to hang out with brilliant young students and graduate students studying astronautics and working in this area. They are highly motivated. And we talk about the aspirational aspects and rationales for human spaceflight. And it's one of those that you can't put a number on, but everybody, it doesn't mean it's not real. The way in which young people are drawn to science and drawn to technology often by this thrilling, adventuresome area. I can just tell you that the activity on the private side excites our students these days probably as much as traditional NASA, and we send a lot of bright young talent to both.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for your service and your interest in space and your testimony here today. So many questions and so little time, really, to get through them. The $64,000 question, 64 million, billion, whatever question, is how we get a consistent plan and a consistent funding level through Congress after Congress, administration after administration. You're familiar with the dozens of missions to nowhere, and we're afraid that we'll see more and more of these. You remember the ISS survived just by one vote, funding for the ISS at one time. And another approach that bears a lot of sense is the X Prize approach. And since there's really no good business model for exploring space, the X Prize process gives a lot of encouragement to that, obviously, a lot of encouragement to private investment, technology development, risk. And I wonder if you have considered that process as well, and what you might think the dollar amounts might be or the milestones might be. I mean, we can have NASA maybe design a car to make 3 laps around the horseshoe out in front of this building, and by the time they're finished, it could be a $5 million car. We can say the first person that could design a car to make 5 laps around that building gets $1 million, and it'd be done in 5 minutes by private industry, and we'd save a lot of money and have what we want to develop for us already. It's been said by experts, the Wright brothers would have never flown if they had to put up with FAA, and I'm afraid that goes for a lot of space entrepreneurs. This is a very difficult country to do business in, and you have to take your hat off and respect any of them that choose to do business here with the overregulation and the red tape that we foist upon our space industry while other governments subsidize theirs. We hassle ours. So your thoughts on that?
I think you
Thank you, Congressman. We didn't talk about the X Prize, or again, we didn't talk about specific commercial approaches because it wasn't part of our task statement or charge. But I do want to point out that we, in the approach that we developed, the Pathways approach, leave the door wide open for commercial innovation in the stepping stones that would lead us ultimately to Mars. And again, I'll quote from the Pathways principles that we developed in our report. Number 4 is to seek continuously to engage new partners that can solve technical and or programmatic impediments to pathway progress. And those partners can be governmental, they could be international, and they could be commercial as well. And without that flexibility, certainly any pathway approach is not going to be very not going to be optimal. We have to be able to involve whatever new ideas and creative approaches that can be brought to bear on such a difficult problem as landing on Mars. Now, the question of how to encourage commercial endeavors, again, it's beyond the committee, and I don't feel particularly qualified to say anything about that. I will say, though, that the overall problem of sending humans to Mars and landing them on Mars, even through this stepping stone approach where you do this in progressive steps that are manageable enough that there's a reasonable chance of success for each one, is such a huge endeavor that it must involve the U.S. government as the primary mover of this whole endeavor, just because of the size and scope. And within the context of that, this committee believes there is ample room for commercial and international involvement. Even it's essential for that involvement.
Thank you. Governor?
Nothing to add. I think that's
right. And Governor, you've seen one administration after another deal with one House and one Senate after another. Right. What do you think the common denominator might be to tie this together? We're all searching for that continuity. Everybody, no matter what direction they're coming from in space, said, hey, you need to have a plan. You all need to stick to a plan, and it needs to be a long-range plan, not plan du jour. It needs to be a long-range plan, and we just can't find that glue that will tie that together.
You put your finger, of course, on the central dilemma. I said in the opening, our report says in almost the same words that we recognize that calling for an approach like this flies in the face of everything back to the 70s, I suppose. Yeah. But we also say that if it seems unrealistic to believe that sort of unity and that sort of continuity could be brought off in our system, then you might as well face up that Mars itself is unrealistic. Yeah. Now, I'm going to engage in some wild wishful thinking here. But I do think, and it was reflected in comments that the ranking member made earlier and others did, at least in theory, this could be one of those subjects that we certainly need more of in this country, on which people who disagree strongly and sincerely about other things could agree, particularly if folks accept the reality that if we're going there at all, it's going to have to be on this base. We're going to have to hold hands, not just in the first Congress that agrees to it, but that's got to be transmitted somehow to those who follow. And yes, that's not the natural state of affairs, but this is not like any other endeavor that I can think of that government or the private sector, for that matter, attempts to bring off. And so I appreciate your question. I think it is, in some respects, the ultimate question here. And forgive me for indulging in the thought that maybe it could all start right here.
Well, that we would like to see that. It just seems like anything short of getting America out of the mall for 15 minutes and away from Dancing with the Stars for 15 minutes and let Neil deGrasse Tyson talk to each one of them for 15 minutes. We could probably pass a constitutional amendment to fund that. But, I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Now recognize Mr. Holtgren.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both so much for being here. Really appreciate your work on this. This is a very important subject. Personal note, Governor Daniels, just want to say thank you for your work. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm from Illinois. Enough said. Do want to thank you. I believe this is so important, and as we continue to assess the future of human spaceflight in the United States, we need to have this discussion. It's certainly something I want to see America leading in, and it's crucial that we get both public and international support to see this happen. Wondered an address to both of you on this. There's an important connection between motivating students to pursue STEM careers and having a visible, active human spaceflight program. Motivating students to pursue these fields is an important factor in the success, certainly, of future space endeavors. How did the panel factor in this need into its recommendations?
Let me start because I think it surfaces a really important point that hasn't come up up to this point. So first of all, we talked about it at great length, agreed that like two or three other rationales for human space flight, it can't be quantified. That doesn't make it any less real or important. And came to the conclusion that when you rolled together those practical or pragmatic reasons with those aspirational, as we called them, reasons, the totality did justify treating this as a priority. The point I would like to make on this count is that over and over the idea of mission frequency, or sometimes called cadence, that is to say, came up for at least two reasons. One, to maintain the technical proficiency necessary for an endeavor like this. If you're only flying every 3 or 4 years, you're losing people, you're losing skills, you're not developing, you're not making enough mistakes probably to learn from, all those things. And you're probably not sustaining public interest among either young people or their elders. And so if you do spend some time in the report, you'll see frequent references to this matter of mission cadence, and I just wanted to use your question as an opportunity to raise it here.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if I could just add briefly, Congressman, your point is very important. This is one of the pragmatic rationales that we talk about in the report, is stimulating and inspiring students as well as citizens in general. And the counterfactual of what would happen if there were no human spaceflight program in terms of what the next generation of aerospace expertise would look like in this country, obviously that would not be a positive change.
Yeah, and I agree so much with you. We have to remember back to the 60s of, the inspiration that was there, but also the benefit, multiple benefit, years and years, decades of advancement in that single decade in medicine and other areas because of the inspiration that was there. Governor, I agree with you as well that we need to find some things that bring us together. This is one of those things that can bring us together. We all agree that we want to encourage our best and brightest to go into STEM education and STEM fields. And this is one of the ways that we can do it at an early age to capture their attention. Wonder for both of you, can NASA accomplish a mission to Mars without the international community, or is that a prerequisite according to your research and report?
From the point of view of the committee's deliberations, in principle the U.S. could do it, but it would be extremely costly, and for a number of different reasons, having significant international collaboration, and here we're talking about international collaboration on a scale in terms of percentage contributions that we have not even seen with the ISS. From a number of standpoints, international collaboration is extremely valuable, both from the point of view of bringing new technical expertise, support on an international basis for these types of activities, and the symbolism of going forward with international partners to a new goal. All of these things make international collaboration highly desirable in this endeavor.
Yeah. Let me end with this, and again offer this out to both of you. I wonder how emphasis on unfocused space technology development in this administration hampered NASA's ability to focus on the long-term goals of human exploration. In particular, interested in J2X and how that impacted exploration missions and other areas, specifically kind of this unfocused space technology development. Any thoughts on that?
Well, no specific comment on that or any other one technology, except to say that the committee strongly feels that an emphasis on capabilities has often led to dead ends or unproductive investments, and that we really need to ask the question from the other end: where are we going? What are the steps on the way to get there? And let that drive the technical and engineering requirements, and therefore the capabilities one develops.
Well, I would only add that your question cuts right to the heart of our report, which is a capabilities-based approach, in our view, is not going to get this nation or anyone to Mars, that we need to have a pathways approach where technologies are developed in the service of the ultimate goal and the stepping stone intermediate goals to that end.
My time's expired. Thanks, Chairman. Thank you again, both. Really appreciate your work and look forward to an ongoing effort here together, hopefully move this forward. I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Daniels, Dr. Lunan, and I apologize, I just got here, and if this question has already been asked, but I wanted to ask you specifically, in what sequence does NASA need to implement your recommendations in this committee's report for everything to take place smoothly?
Well, the sequence I think that matters most, Congressman, is the commitment to a pathways approach, and the selection of a pathway, followed by the commitment to sustain funding for that pathway. I would put them in that order very purposefully, because we did talk a little earlier. More money spent in the way we've been doing for the last several administrations probably doesn't advance things very far.
And also, the report recommends a pathways approach over both the capabilities approach and the flexible path approach. But we don't need a flexible path approach to mission planning in order to deal with these unexpected changes in the budget and to take advantage of technology breakthroughs. Is that your opinion, or do you think that or just the opposite of that?
Well, what the committee finds attractive about the pathways approach is that it streamlines the development of technologies in the sense that, again, to get to Mars as the ultimate horizon goal is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And so the technologies that will need to be developed are expensive and they're difficult. And so one wants, if one is committing as a nation to going to Mars, to adopt an approach that minimizes the number of additional technologies that have to be developed on the way to Mars, because they're all expensive and they all, of course, take time, and that plays into the ultimate timeline of any program that leads to Mars. So the pathways approach is the way to minimize the total number of technologies that have to be developed in order to achieve the ultimate horizon goal, in this case Mars. Flexible path approach, you may end up developing technologies that in the end are not useful and are not therefore ultimately contributing to the final goal that you want to get to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.
The National Academies undertook a comprehensive review of the future of human space exploration in the United States. That review has been completed, and it is now up to Congress and the administration to decide what we will do in response to the findings and recommendations contained in its final report. This is a report that does not mince words, and for that we should be very grateful. As I said when the report was first released, the National Academies has provided the nation with an important wake-up call. Their conclusions are clear. We are not going to have a human space exploration program worthy of this great nation if we continue down the current path of failing to provide the resources needed to make real progress and failing to embrace a clear goal and pathway to achieving that goal. As members of Congress, the ball is in our court, and we have choices to make. We can choose to continue to argue about which president or who in Congress is to blame for the current state of our human space exploration program, but I earnestly hope that we won't. We are where we are, and we can't change the past. Our focus needs to be on how we proceed from this point forward. And I hope that our witnesses can provide some useful counsel to us in that regard. In addition, we can choose to continue to pretend that a business-as-usual approach to our human space exploration program will suffice. But I hope we won't do that either, because the report we're reviewing today makes clear that business as usual is not a sustainable approach. Whatever resources we're able to invest need to be invested effectively and efficiently toward the attainment of a clearly articulated goal. We really can't afford to do otherwise. Finally, the National Academies panel makes clear that we don't have unlimited time to decide what kind of human space exploration program we want for the nation. It may be tempting for some to say that we shouldn't invest necessary resources in space exploration.
The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Pathways to Exploration, a review of the future of human space exploration. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas. At a fundamental level, space exploration, the mission of NASA, is about inspiration. This inspiration fuels our desire to push the boundaries of the possible and reach beyond our own pale blue dot. When the President canceled the Constellation program in 2010, our chance to explore beyond low Earth orbit was significantly delayed. To the dismay of the American people, the administration made it clear that human space exploration was not a priority. The first human footsteps on the moon are a distant memory, and with the retirement of the space shuttle, NASA now pays Russia $70 million to transport an American astronaut to the International Space Station and back. There's a sense that America is falling behind with our best days behind us. Today, America's finest spaceships and largest rockets are found in museums rather than on launch pads. The President has proposed capturing an asteroid and tugging it into lunar orbit for human exploration. But NASA's own advisors said, quote, it was not considered to be a serious proposal, end quote. Space exploration experts have criticized this plan before our committee, and former NASA officials have called into question its merits. The administration's continued focus on costly distractions is harmful to our space program and does not inspire future generations to go into innovative fields such as science and math. However, a distinguished panel of experts has concluded that a return to, quote, extended surface operations on the moon, end quote, would make significant contributions to landing people on Mars. The same has not been said for the asteroid retrieval mission, which is a mission without a realistic budget, without a destination, and without a certain launch date. The witnesses before us today represent decades of public policy work and scientific investigation. They co-chaired the Committee on Human Spaceflight that recently released a report entitled Pathways to Exploration, Rationales and Approaches for a U.S. Program of Human Space Exploration. This report confirmed that NASA lacks a plan for human space exploration. The NASA Authorization Act, which recently passed the House, requires a detailed plan for how NASA will land humans on Mars. This report offers suggestions on the best way to reach that goal. Meanwhile, the Obama administration continues to advocate increasing climate change funding at NASA at the expense of other priorities such as space exploration. There are 18 federal agencies that fund climate change research, but only one does space exploration. The future of America's exploration efforts lead to Mars. Just as the first steps on the moon were by Americans, the first flag to fly on another planet in our solar system should be that of the United States. Great nations do great things. President Kennedy's call to America wasn't just about reaching the moon. It was a reminder that we are an exceptional nation. We must rekindle within NASA the fire that blazed the trail to the moon. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all. I'd like also to welcome our distinguished witnesses to today's hearing. I make no secret of the fact that I consider National Aeronautics and Space Administration to be a critical national asset. NASA is a source of technological and scientific innovation, an inspiration to generations of young people, a catalyst for economic growth, and a very positive symbol of American preeminence worldwide, as well as visible demonstration of our commitment to international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. Simply put, NASA is about the future. Now it is a fact that NASA's human spaceflight activities account for a significant share of the resources invested in NASA. We need to ensure that those resources are invested wisely. That is why this morning's hearing is so important. At Congress's direction, until we first fix Medicare or Medicaid, eliminate the deficit, or address a host of other major policy issues that have been identified by members at various times, it's tempting to use those issues as an excuse for inaction. But the National Academies makes a compelling case that we do not have that luxury if we want to maintain meaningful human space exploration capability in this nation, which I strongly believe we do. We should, of course, address those other issues, but that should not prevent us from investing in our future in the meantime. And make no mistake about it, our nation's human space exploration program, with an ultimate goal of landing humans on Mars, is about our future and that of our children and grandchildren. Mr. Chairman, the National Academies has done a great service by understanding the study that we will be undertaking, the study that we will be hearing about today. I hope that this morning's hearing will be the first step in achieving a revitalized and focused exploration program for America. I want to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do just that. In closing, I again want to welcome our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We will now proceed to introduce the witnesses. And to introduce our first witness, I'll recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our first witness is Governor Mitch Daniels, the president of Purdue University, which has graduated 23 astronauts, including Neil Armstrong. Prior to this appointment, he served 2 terms as the 49th governor of my home state of Indiana. He also served as Chief of Staff to Senator Richard Lugar, Senior Advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and Director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush. In addition to his strong record of public service, he has served as a senior executive at Eli Lilly, based in Indianapolis, among other positions he's held. President Daniels earned his bachelor's degree from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton and his J.D. from Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome, Governor Daniels.
Thank you, Dr. Buchan. I'll introduce our second witness, who is Dr. Jonathan Lunine, the director of the Center for Radiophysics and Space Research and the David C. Duncan Professor in the Physical Sciences at Cornell University. He is co-investigator of the Juno mission to Jupiter and an interdisciplinary scientist for the James Webb Space Telescope. Dr. Lunine has chaired and served on committees for NASA and the National Science Foundation. He also is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Lunine received his bachelor's in physics and astronomy from the University of Rochester and his master's and PhD in planetary science from the California Institute of Technology. We welcome you both today. It's nice to have 2 experts on the subject present, and Governor Daniels will begin with you.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, we thank you for this opportunity to be here on behalf of our Committee on Human Spaceflight, established in response to the NASA Authorization Act of 2010. That act called on NASA to ask the national academies to review the goals, core capabilities, and direction of our nation's human spaceflight program. And we released our report on June 5th. Dr. Lenine and I are here to summarize it for you. As envisioned in that 2010 act, the committee membership was very diverse, composed not solely or even mostly of experts from the human spaceflight community, but instead had members from fields as diverse as planetary science, astronomy, political science and history, sociology, public opinion and polling, economics, human spaceflight experience, international peace and security, and others. All of us came into this process with open minds and brought to the work our divergent points of view. In the end, we came to the strong consensus that there is a convincing case to be made for a continuation of our nation's human spaceflight program, provided that the pathways, approach, and decision rules recommended in our report are adopted. We did so because we became convinced only after lengthy discussion and analysis that a combination of what we labeled the pragmatic and the aspirational rationales, including the human impulse to